Thank you, Keon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. And I know at the end of this webinar, you should receive valuable information that would help you to improve your internal audit process. So first, let me introduce myself for those of you who are not familiar with me. I'm Candel Walcott Bostwick. I'm the CEO of Global Compliance Service, and I would have served close to 2 decades in the field of standardization, quality assurance, also experience in conducting audits. Most of my career was spent at the Guyana National Bureau of Standards. So at the moment, I am a GCS certified auditor and also a trainer. And you will see my other experiences, especially in terms of conducting audits. So I'll share with you some of the tips so that you can improve your internal audit process. All right, so let me tell you a little about Global Compliance Service. For those of you who for the first time tuning in and you would have heard about us, we are Guyanese's own business, and we are the only ISO certification registrar in Guyana. So we're basically here in Guyana to meet your ISO certification needs. So local businesses do not have to go overseas now for ISO certification. It is available in Guyana. And of course, we provide you with globally recognized ISO certification and training services. Our headquarters is in Geneva, Switzerland, and we work through the office in the USA. So for today's webinar, we're going to focus on conducting internal audits. And why it's important, because I've noticed over the years that many companies make mistakes when they're conducting internal audits, and they're unable to get value for the internal audits. And some persons really disregard the evidence from internal audits. And we would like to show you today how you can use internal audits to make value to your organization. So we're going to look at what is an audit, the benefits of conducting your internal audits, the internal audit process, and how you can use those results for continual improvement. Because as we know, when we conduct audits, it's basically to allow you to improve your system, but it must be done in a particular way. So for those of you who are in the Zoom room, can anyone write quickly for me, what is an internal audit? And especially those of you who would have done audits before, let me see what are your thoughts on internal audits. Right, so it'll be good to share with the group. All right. So look and see if this is what you thought an internal audit is. And basically what I can tell you, the reference for audits comes from the ISO 19011 standard. And that is a standard that provides guidance for conducting management systems audits. So it's good if you have a copy of that standard. And this is also the standard used by your certification body to conduct audits. So basically an audit, as you would see in the definition, is a systematic, independent, and documented process for obtaining objective evidence. So the purpose, one of the main purposes of an audit is to obtain objective evidence, or what we will say facts, and evaluating it objectively to determine the extent at which audit criteria are fulfilled. So the audit criteria, there must be an audit criteria in order for an audit to be conducted. And an audit criteria basically identifies, okay, if it's a standard, like for example, the ISO 9001 standard you're auditing to, if it's your management system process that you're auditing to, so there must be stated requirements that you're auditing against. You could be auditing your purchasing procedure, the criteria for your purchasing, your criteria for auditing your purchasing procedure, your purchasing process will be your purchasing procedure. So before we could start conducting an internal audit, we must have the requirements or guidelines to which we will be auditing to. So don't let anyone fool you that you can audit without requirements. We do not audit based on opinions or based on what we think should be the requirements. So these requirements need to be agreed upon by the company in advance before we can actually say whether you're meeting requirements or not. Now, these are some of the benefits of conducting internal audits, and there are many more benefits, but I'll just share with you some of the main benefits. First of all, when you're conducting an internal audit, you must set out your objectives. Why are you conducting internal audits? And you must do it for the right reason. For example, if you want to monitor the conformance to your quality system, those of you on the call, you may be, for example, developing your quality system because you want to become ISO 9001 compliant, or it may be compliant to another ISO standard or even a national standard. So you conduct internal audits at periodic time frames, which will be agreed upon within your company. So often you'll do the audit to see how well you are conforming to your quality system. Right? So you monitor your conformance because the results of the internal audit will indicate to you if you have non-conformities, and a non-conformity is basically a non-fulfillment of a requirement. You're not meeting or you're not doing what your procedure documents that you will do, or what is the established system. So you see how well you're conforming. In terms of legal requirements, you could actually be doing an internal audit to see how well you're meeting your legal requirements associated with your business. Are you, for example, doing your registration on time? Are you meeting the different clauses stated in the legal requirements? You can also do an audit to see how well you are conforming to those requirements. You could even look at identifying opportunities for improvement, because with an internal audit, once it's done the right way, you will see areas for improvement. You may be able to identify some areas of weaknesses, some areas of strengths that you can work on improving. You're able to monitor customer perception. I don't know how many of you would have done customer surveys, but I'm sure from those customer surveys, you were able to identify areas where you can improve either your product or your service based on the feedback from your customers. And that is very important because remember, you would want to ensure that you're meeting customer requirements. So it's good to seek their feedback. So during an internal audit, you will actually be able to see how well you're meeting customer requirements. Because those of you familiar with the ISO 9001 standard, you will see once you conduct the survey, the customer survey, you have to evaluate the findings of that survey and see and use that information to improve your customer experience. And also you increase awareness across your business, because when you're conducting an internal audit and that audit report is completed, management will share with the organization the findings of the audit. So you know the areas where to focus your resources on, the areas that you need to improve on, and those areas that you are performing well in. So internal audits are really beneficial to a company. Once we do it the right way, we will get great value for our internal audits. Now, before you is a diagram of the audit process. as documented in the ISO 19011 standard. So I will briefly go through that process. I hope you're able to look at the image. And if you notice, it is divided into what we would call the denim cycle, the process of plan, do, check, and act. And in anything we do, planning is very important. So when we're setting up our internal audit process, we have to plan the process so that we can execute it well and get the desired results. So for example, the first aspect before we actually start to do the audits, we have to establish our internal audit program. Right, and establishing an internal audit program, as we will see in the ISO 9001 at clause 9.2, it requires that we establish an internal audit program. And any audit management system standard, there's a section where a company is required to do an internal audit. And when you're ISO 9001 compliant or compliant to any ISO standard, you're required to establish an internal audit program. So in establishing the program, one of the first things you have to do is to establish the objectives of the program. Why are you conducting your internal audit? And an example can be to monitor the level of conformance to your quality management system. That could be an example of an objective, why you're doing an audit. To monitor conformance to the ISO 9001 standard. Or it could be you want to ensure you conform to your legal requirements. Then the next step is that you determine and evaluate the audit program in terms of risk and opportunities. Now, when we're deciding the audit program, we'll have to establish how often we'll be conducting audits. And one of the principles followed for the quality system is that we must adopt the risk-based approach, meaning that we must ensure that we audit those areas that have higher risk to the business more often than others. So you'll find some areas are not very high risk. So at least you'll audit them at least once per year, but there are some sections you'll audit more than once because it's considered high risk. And what I mean, for example, if your company, let's say in your personnel department, you would have conducted your first audit and you're aware that all of your staff, let's say, would have met the necessary competency level to perform their duties. And your staff complement would have remained stable for, let's say, for a year or 2 years. So if you're setting up your internal audit process, that may be one section that you'll just audit once for the year. And high risk area, for example, could be those with your main processes. For example, the process for manufacturing, your process to ensure that your product are conforming to specifications, your process for corrective action to ensure that your corrective actions are effectively implemented, and the necessary actions are taken. So within the company, you have to determine what are the high-risk areas or the high-risk processes that you should monitor at every audit. So some of us may have a program that may require audits to be done once a year, twice a year, right? So you must be able to say, why is it you've selected, the program that you are using? Sometimes risk can also apply to the availability of competent auditors within the company to perform the audits also. So you may have to source auditors, right? So these are some of the areas that you could look at when you're looking at risk. So you must evaluate the risk of your audit program. And you establish your audit program to see how often you will do it, right? Because it's very important that it is communicated to all relevant parties throughout the years. Customarily, persons do what we call an audit schedule, an internal audit schedule. So at the beginning of the calendar year, everyone is notified as to when audits will be conducted. So everyone is aware and you can prepare and you can, have the necessary resources like time, for example, available to facilitate that audit. After you would have executed that audit, you have to monitor the effectiveness of the audit to ensure that you would have met all of your requirements set out in the program. And you go through the process of the plan, do, check cycle. Section 6.2 or clause 6 of that standard deals with the actual initiating of the audit process, which is very important for you. And this is a section where you actually the audit. So you initiate the audit, and now the audit is initiated. Is, for example, remember you would have done the schedule at the beginning of the year. So let's say you have an audit scheduled for October the 5th. Now, if that schedule was out since January, sometime in September, you will now inform or remind those who would be involved in the audit, who are your auditees, that, okay, remember this audit is coming up October the 5th. The scope of the audit, that is what areas will be audited or what processes will be audited. So you basically initiate that process and you make contact with the auditee. So remember, this is an internal audit, so this is within the organization. So sometimes this is not as formal as if it's an external audit. And you can do little adjustments if it is necessary, but you would want the audit to be successful to ensure that all who should be participating in that audit are available. And then you prepare for your audit activities. And your preparation would include having the documents that you're going to review. So for example, as I mentioned, you will need to have something established, a system established at your company to do the audit. If it's your process flow diagrams, your SOPs, your policy manuals, your technical manuals, wherever you have your information documented that is relevant to the scope of that audit, who is assigned as the auditor will take those documents and they will review it so they can prepare their checklists so that the audit can be an effective process. Because you remember, we said we need audit criteria to audit to, and they can only audit to what you would have documented in your system. So after you've done your preparation, you then go to conduct the audit activity, which will be within a particular department, where you go to that department and you interview the key staff on the system. It involves you reviewing records, making observations, interviewing your staff, right? So that you're able to determine how well that department has been complying with their process. Many times we've seen in internal audits, the focus is only on the quality system. If the company has a quality manual, and that is it. But your audit must also include your operations. If it's your manufacturing process for jams and jellies, your manufacturing process for, if you're processing, let's say, fresh fruits and vegetables, if you have a bakery, any operation that you're doing at your business, all of those activities should be part of your internal audit. And you don't have to audit all at the same time. That is why in the audit schedule, you can say, okay, we'll be auditing this process at this audit, the other process at another audit, to see how well those processes are being implemented. So after that audit is conducted, you have what you call your audit report, or your audit findings will be communicated to the auditee. Now, if your company is one that is very big, sometimes the audits may last more than 1 day. So based on that schedule, the auditor will inform the client, the auditee, daily of their findings during the audit, so they're kept abreast. And I know it should be much simpler because you're dealing with your own staff within the company. So the process should be much simpler since you're working colleagues. So any non-conformity is identified during the audit, and of course the auditor has to be able to show the auditee, who is the particular department being audited, why this non-conformance exists, right? And you show the evidence. And so the auditee now has to do the necessary corrective actions, which we'll go into more detail a little later, to ensure that there is not a recurrence. It's very important that you follow through. So this diagram just basically gives you a quick schematic representation of the internal audit program and the audit process, right? And that is what I would have gone through in that slide there. So in initiating the audit is very important. And from what I would have explained, you see the importance of having auditors trained on your team. Because if someone is not, for example, familiar with the audit process, that is where we can have what you call it, persons being dissatisfied with the findings of the audit and persons challenging the findings of the audit. And those of you who would have had internal audits before, I'm sure you can agree with that. Sometimes you get non-conformities and you say, oh, I don't agree with that. That is not true. Right? So the audit principles, there's some audit principles that auditors must follow. And you would only be familiar with these principles once you would have gone through an internal audit class. Right? So the first principle, an auditor must be one with integrity. That is, you must be very professional when you're conducting your audits. Be fair in your presentation. That is, your findings must be accurate. You must present accurately and be able to validate it against the requirements of the procedure that you're auditing to or the policy that you're auditing to. It's not an event where you go searching for faults or digging for errors. Audit should not be used as a process to penalize staff, because you remember, with an audit, you're auditing a system that has been established by the company. And if you're auditing to the system and there are weaknesses in the system, it's basically telling you that there is room for improvement. So, for example, if you audit a particular process, and let's say this process has 6 steps, and you find out that the staff, when they basically, because sometimes in the audit process, we ask the auditee, who could be the staff from that department, explain to me how you execute this activity. And when they explain to you, you will find that probably they've missed 2 steps or they're not doing it in the order. So one of the things, you can ask as an auditor, I've noticed your procedure says you follow step 1 to 5, but in your response, you've only given me 3 steps. And you allow them to look at the procedure and they'll basically say, if they say, for example, I've never seen this procedure before, right? That could be an indication that the system was not communicated to the staff. It could be, okay, that was an outdated procedure. We've changed the procedure a few months ago. That could be a non-conformity in terms of document control. The document control system is not working, because if a procedure was updated, it meant that the person responsible for ensuring that the current documents are available to staff, they did not go through the process of recalling the old documents and issuing the new documents. So it tells you that your document control system caused that non-conformity. And so you have to look at strengthening the document control system. If it was a case where the new document was issued, but the staff wasn't aware or they never saw it, you have to look at the process of training. Because if a new procedure is introduced, staff need to be trained on that procedure to ensure that they're competent. And if you find that the staff was trained, after training, I'm sure we all know we do a process of observation and checking when something new comes into the system to ensure that there is conformance. So audit is a very, very important process, and it can really allow you to see where are the system weaknesses within your organization. It's no fault of the staff, but it is a system because we're auditing the system, and we must want to ensure that we improve that system, right? So it could have been something that caused that to happen. And that's where the corrective action comes into play to look at the root cause analysis. Due professional care, well, I've explained it in my example just now, right? We must ensure that we accurately record our findings. Confidentiality is very important, especially in organizations, especially I think the smaller organizations, because if we've identified a staff as an internal auditor, and this is one of the areas I think management should really look at, so the staff they identify as the internal auditor, that person must be very confidential because they will have access to a lot of information about, for example, their colleagues. When, for example, they have to audit personnel files and training and so forth. So it depends on how we also keep our documents. So confidentiality is very important because that staff must be matured enough to not divulge information obtained during the audit and use it for purposes not intended. The information gathered through the audit about staff, about processes, even if they go to department and see non-conformities, they're tied to the confidentiality of the audit process. It's not to use the information against other staff to deal with other matters. Just excuse me one moment, please. Yes, sorry about that. And I think my slide went up a bit. Yes, I was going through the audit principles. Independence. It's very important too that you select auditors who are independent of the process being audited. Right? So the auditors must be independent. It is not good to have auditors who are auditing their own process. Okay? Yes, so it's the persons must be independent of the process being audited. Evidence-based, as I mentioned, we must have evidence available to show how we've come up with a non-conformity. So it's evidence-based. It's not based on opinion. So we cannot say, okay, I don't believe the machine operator is competent because they're making a lot of mistakes, right? That shouldn't be part of the process. Okay? So we need to ensure that the evidence that we provide in our audits can be verifiable even after the audit. Okay? And I spoke of the risk-based approach. The number of times we audit a particular area must be based on the risk involved. right? So high risk areas will be, for example, those for production, those for manufacturing, those areas where we have a lot of non-conformity that may be occurring, and so forth. So these are very critical areas that we have to look at when evaluating our quality system. Any questions so far? Am I flowing well? Okay. All right. So when selecting auditors, it's very important that we make the right choices when selecting our auditors. So, first of all, based on the standard being audited, right? We have to ensure that that person was trained on the standard. Okay? That person must be trained on the standard. Because if we want to ensure that we get value for our audit, the staff must be aware of the requirements of the standard. So those of you who are moving towards the ISO 9001 requirement system, for example, you must ensure the person that you've selected for the audits, they're familiar with the requirements of the standard, or they would have been trained on the requirements of the standard. And it's also important to ensure that they would have at least sat in an internal audit course so that they're familiar with the audit principles, how to conduct an audit, and how to prepare for an audit so that it can be effectively done at your facility. So those of you, for example, who are interested in attending our internal audit course, you can basically register with us, and we'll make contact with you as soon as we would have scheduled that program, right? So we would want to have value for money. Experience in conducting internal audits is also important. We must ensure that persons, you might say that the staff, would have been trained and they do not have the relevant experience, but you have to provide that exposure. And it's good if in the internal audit training, I should say, there is some exposure towards the audit process, so they'll have an understanding as to how to go about conducting the audit. And the more audits they conduct internally, it's more experience they're gaining. So if, for example, you're not using one of your staff and you are soliciting the services of an external auditor, it's very important that you allow that person to send you, let's say, a copy of their CV. So you could look to see the areas of experience in conducting audits. And it does not have to be for ISO 9001, because based on the ISO 19011 standard, once you're trained as an internal auditor or an external auditor, you follow the same audit principles. The principles do not vary. The same audit process is applied. So you can use persons with audit experience, especially if you have to pay external persons to do your audits. They must be familiar with the process being audited. So when you bring an external person, they will also, you have to assign them to confidentiality, because they will also be exposed to your company's internal operations and systems. And they have to sign to ensure that they do not share this information with external parties. So it's important that you let your external auditors, or those who are coming to do the internal audits on your behalf, that they are trained and they understand confidentiality process. So it's similar for your staff. They sign for confidentiality in terms of the findings of the internal audit. So your staff, if you're using them, they should also sign on. And as they do the audits, you keep a record of the audits they're doing so that their auditor competence can be recorded. So how do you treat your audit results? I know the reactions you see on the screen. Some of you might be, I would say, guilty of doing the same. Sometimes you get an internal audit, the audit is finished, you get a report, and you might be in denial. You do not believe the audit results, or you just say no action required. And why that happens, it's when we do not have confidence in the audit process. And we will not have confidence in the audit process if we do not select the right audit team, if we do not ensure that the persons who are conducting the audit would have been trained so that they can do the audit in a professional manner. There is also an area where the staff can also declare whether they're not comfortable auditing a particular department. For whatever reasons, it could be that they've been in the department. Sometimes it may be a department where the auditor is auditing a department that they do not have that good relationship with the staff. All of those things can influence the outcome for the audit. That's why it's very important that we select auditors who can objectively audit. So when the results are presented, we value the results, right? Because we know why we would have conducted the audit. So even if you get 10 non-conformances, 20 non-conformances, or 1 non-conformity, once the audit is done the way it should be done, we should all accept those results as opportunities for improvement. And just bear in mind, you're auditing the system. It's telling you there is a weakness in the system established at your company. So it's not about the people in the department. It's about the systems, and it tells you that the systems need improvement. And the only way you can get value for that is if you act on improving those systems. So this is just a reminder from what I was telling you before, right? That you need to establish an internal audit program. An internal audit is not a process where you wake up one day and say, oh, I want to do an internal audit. It's something that has to be planned. It's something that has to be executed by trained personnel to ensure that you get value for the process. It's like with any other activity within your operation. If you do not train the machine operator, if you do not train your customer service representative, if you do not train your marketing representative, if you do not train your laboratory technician or your inspectors, you should not expect them to give you the best of the results. There will be mistakes and errors. Likewise, if you do not train your internal auditors or ensure they're adequately trained, you will get similar results that you wouldn't want. So I would encourage all of us, if you do not have an internal audit program, now is the time for you to identify for staff that you know it's suitable and capable of conducting your internal audits, and you have them trained as an internal auditor. Just like how you will have the machine operator trained, or the production manager trained, or the quality manager trained, commitment also needs to be provided to your internal auditors. So remember, an audit is not the opportunity where you go digging for errors and looking for mistakes. Now, once an audit is done in a professional manner, by a trained auditor or an internal auditor is very useful if the company can discuss the audit findings. There are some companies who've done internal audits and management does not share the internal audit report with staff because some staff may feel that, okay, I got 10 non-conformities, so my department is not doing well compared with another department with 2 or no non-conformities. It just indicates that your system has to be improved. And the next audit, so once you do a great corrective action process, your next audit, you can be rest assured you will not have those non-conformities. So you discuss the audit findings and you take the necessary actions. Now, one of the things I would like to discuss where there can be some misconception is, for example, correction and corrective action. Many times we apply correction to a nonconformity. We see a leaking roof, we just patch the area. Our vehicle maintenance, our vehicle is breaking down pretty often. We're having delays in delivering customer service. Whenever the vehicle breaks down, we take it to the mechanic shop and there is downtime. So that's the correction. There is a fire, as you see in the picture, you out it with the fire extinguisher. But when you look at the corrective action process, you go into more depth of actually solving the problem. So for example, with a leaking roof, after you finish patching it, it is now time for you to go and source where the leak came from and address that source. Your vehicle is breaking down pretty often. You have to go to the mechanic shop. It's affecting customer service. Why not implement a maintenance schedule which avoids or prevents breakdowns? Because once you have an active maintenance schedule, your vehicle will have program times for maintenance, which may prevent those frequent breakdowns or emergency breakdowns that they will be called, right? So we need to put systems in place when there is a non-conformity to ensure that there is no repeat of that non-conformity. I hope everyone is following me and I'm not going too fast. So after we would have implemented corrective action, we need to monitor the action taken to see if it's been effective and report on it. And that is one of the functions of the internal auditor. So after the audit, it's not that they do the report and that's it. They now will have to sit with the auditee, that is the department audited, and they will say, okay, we will complete our corrective actions by these timelines. And the auditor now has to go and review to see if those non-conformities have been addressed, right? Because we would not want a recurrence. So for example, if the company said, okay, we've sourced the leak, but when you go to investigate as an auditor, you see the roof is still leaking. Shows that that corrective action was not effective. So the auditee has to return to the table and say, okay, we need to look at another option. Right? So we have to be very careful. Don't let us do corrections and think it's corrective action. Before you are do figures to basically driving the point of having a root cause analysis done, which will make your corrective action process very effective. It's important that we identify the underlying cause. And all of you will have different circumstances at your particular facility to say how well your system is working. You know the resources that are available at your facility in order for you to address a particular non-conformity. Sometimes it requires improvement in infrastructure. Sometimes it may require you training of your staff, probably documenting procedures or developing systems that were not present before. So we must be willing to investigate those problems. So based on the cycle I have there, we must first identify and define a problem, which the auditor would do in the form of a non-conformity statement. You as the auditee will now analyze that problem and identify possible solutions. And you look at the one that you could work with in the first instance, that's most feasible. So from your solutions, you set one, you plan, and you implement. You implement that solution and you monitor it. If it's effective, you close out that non-conformity. If not, you look at another solution and you implement. And so the cycle will continue until you are finished. Right? So I hope you're all following. So from today, those of you who are doing corrections will now start to do corrective actions. And as part of your corrective action process, right? I talk about the root cause analysis. So in doing the root cause analysis, you actually have to be aware of root cause analysis tools or problem solving tools that you can use to address your problems. And the simplest one that is commonly used is the 5 whys. And I'm sure all of you will know the 5 whys. You ask why 5 times. So by the time you reach the 5th why, that should be your root cause of the problem. There are root cause tools like brainstorming. You can use flow charts where you map out the process to see where the error could have taken place. You can use a cause and effect diagram, the Pareto diagram. So it's very important that you have a number of tools at your disposal to address your problems. Because according to Abraham Maslow, you don't want to have a hammer. So all of your problems would seem to be nails, right? So have a collection of problem solving tools, and based on a problem identified, you can apply that tool to your operation. So there are many problem solving tools for root cause analysis, which will be part of your corrective action process. So I'll also encourage you to you can seek training on the root cause analysis tools, or you can seek sources from the internet that will explain to you how these tools are done if you have not adopted them as yet. So effective audits are planned, process-based, they're conducted by competent auditors and documented. So at the end of an audit, you will have your checklist from the auditor, your audit report, and the findings of the audit, which is your non-conformity statement, your corrective action plan, and evidence of the corrective action being monitored. When you're going through your stage 1 audit, one of the records you have to present to us to commence your process is the findings of your audit. So we will ask you for a copy of your last audit report. And if you had your corrective action plan in place to see if your corrective actions, if they were non-conformities identified, if they were effectively implemented. Right? So it's very important that we benefit from the audit. And, with a checklist, it's very important that I stress on this point. The checklist does not have to be a mirror of the standard you're using. At this point, you're doing an internal audit. Now, when you've implemented your ISO 9001 system, for example, it will be a clear indication that you would have met the requirements of that standard. So that stage is completed. If you're a company that you're now starting the process the first thing you'll do is a gap analysis. And there is a difference between a gap analysis and an internal audit. At a gap analysis, you basically identifying the gaps between your existing system and the ISO 9001 standard, if that is the standard you're working with. And with those gaps, you then do an action plan to implement. So you close the gaps. Now, after you would have closed the gaps now, you can now say you're 9001 compliant. And then you start to implement the quality system. So when you do the internal audit, it's part of your implementation process where you're using the system that you've developed to create your checklist and the audit against that. So your auditor has to create a checklist using your quality system documents, your SOPs, your policies, whatever you have in place at your company. So it's focusing on your quality system, not the standard. Some auditors may also have reference to the standard, but don't be carried away with the requirements of the standard, because your quality system tells you how you're implementing the requirements of the standard, and it also tells you how well you are conforming to your QMS, since you would have already addressed the gaps during your implementation process. So I hope that is clear. You'll have your audit report. The ISO 19011 standard also speaks to the content of the audit report. There is a standard content that you can follow. Some of the basic things that you will have in your audit report will include the name of the auditor, the scope of the audit. You must know the sections that were audited, the dates of the audit, the findings of the audit, if there are any non-conformities, so you have the non-conformities, the reference. Also, if it's the purchasing procedure and there is a non-conformity, the reference should be to SOP 100, page 2, or SOP 100, section 3. There is where the non-conformity was, is referenced to. So anybody else can always go and verify after you the non-conformity that you have identified. Right? So you have a description of a non-conformity, and it's good if you have a non-conformity report that you can leave with your auditee at the end of the day or at the end of that audit, so that they can use that non-conformity report as a record to do their corrective action, while you have it also documented in the audit report. And of course, the audit will present to you their corrective action plan, which will state how they intend to address all of the non-conformities and by when. So as the auditor, you know when you have to return to that department to verify that the non-conformities were corrected and they were effective, and then you sign off accordingly. So it's very important that we take the internal audit process as a very serious process, and it's one that will add value to any business once it is used the right way and it is used following the correct process. So I would like to end off with the quote by Edward Denham. Without data, you're just another person with an opinion. So when conducting an internal audit, you actually get data that you can work with. And the data are the audit findings from that audit. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. So I can open now for questions. If there are any questions, I can respond to those questions. And I hope the information that is shared with you was indeed valuable, and it will help you to improve your audit system at your facility. Thank you very much for your attention. right. Yes, the ISO 9001 internal auditor training. We have one that will be scheduled for November, but at the moment we will be requesting participants who are interested in the program to call and register with our office, and we will confirm the date. That course is $140,000, and it is for 3 days. And the course will be run virtually. The participant will receive a manual at the end of the program, also a certificate. They'll have to complete a short exam at the end, and a certificate from our certification body, which of course will have a unique ID and it's verifiable. So you have a good package with our training. So you can register with us, and we will contact you as soon as we have the numbers to host the course. Thank you. Yes, Keon. Global Compliance Service provides monthly training programs on the ISO 9001 requirements course every last Tuesday and Wednesday for the month from 13 hours to 16 hours 30. And that training program explains the requirements of the standard. It basically provides an interpretation to the requirements of the standard. So companies who are interested in ISO 9001 certification, they're encouraged to at least train their team members so they understand what the company has to implement. And also, based on understanding that, you'll be able to see that the ISO 9001 system now is not as complex as in the earlier version. We're now using the 2015 version, which provides for greater flexibility in terms of developing the quality system. Also, if you would have implemented the system, those of you on the way, we are also providing the free stage 1 audit. For certification, it requires 2 stages, stage 1 and stage 2. The stage 1 audit is the document audit where we review your documents and give an indication as to whether you are ready for the stage 2 audits. So what companies need to do, especially those who are implementing their system at the moment, they can send in an application to us, which will include them defining their scope for certification, and also probably the number of locations they have and the number of personnel that are within the scope for certification. We provide an estimate of what your certification cost will be. And after you would have approved that quotation, we will proceed by doing the stage 1 audit. And doing a stage 1 audit, you're not obligated to use us, but we know that we provide the best prices in Guyana, since our auditors are right in Guyana. So it eliminates the cost of airfare and accommodation for auditors traveling from overseas. So those are the packages we have at the moment, and we'll have the internal auditor course coming up in November, which persons can register with our office. You can register now in the chat box by putting your name and number, or you can always call the office and register, and we'll make contact with you. Mm-hmm. follow-up. No, the internal auditor course on the first day, we would actually go through the requirements of the standard. So you can do the internal auditor course and be familiar with the requirements of the standard. In terms of follow-up training, it depends on the organization and the competence of the staff. Based on my experience, it's really good to sit in at least, I would think, two internal audit classes. Because sometimes, especially if you're exposed to the standard for the first time, you may not get all of the principles, right? Some of us learn at different levels and a different pace. So once you do the first audit and you start to do your audits on location, because it's important that after you've completed the training, you start to do your internal audits to put the theory into practice. And after that, you do not have to do any additional training, I would say. It's a good practice to do a refresher probably every 2 to 3 years. That training could even be done internally at your company. So let's say a staff is trained and they have the capability of training other staff at the facility. That will also help them with their capabilities and the audits. It's also even good if you can team up with another company. Let's say a group of you have been trained as internal auditors, and if you know of someone experienced in conducting audit, they can actually come and guide you through the process during your first audit, so you become very comfortable. And you after a time you will get very competent. The more audits you do, it's much better for you. So it's not necessary to do many follow-ups. It depends on the individual staff. Standards are reviewed on an average of about 5 to 8 years. So when a new standard is published, you can also do a follow-up to be acquainted with the new requirements. September. September, we have one next Tuesday and Wednesday, September 29th and 30th. So they can register for that program if they are interested. The investment is $43,000. Yes. Yes. Yes, and we would advise that they register at least latest by Monday, because on payment they will receive a link to access the training program from 13 hours on Tuesday. All right, and thank you again for tuning in. And we look forward to being your partner for ISO certification and your training services. Thank you and have a great rest of the day.